Good morning. This is the first in the series of Irish history lectures to support the partition of Ireland course. And in today's brief mini lecture, I want to focus on the Home Rule movement as part of the background to the Home Rule crisis. The Home Rule movement, and in fact, the Home Rule Party, was the dominant force in Irish nationalism and in Irish politics in general from the mid 1880s, really up until the 1918 general election, but certainly up to that middle period of the 1910s. And the Home Rule Party really vanished in Southern Ireland in the 1918 general election. And I think that having a good understanding of the party and its legacy is important for a number of future topics within this particular module and course. Its legacy was still evident after that. And it was very much the dominant force in Irish public life in general. I mean, if you wanted to progress in Irish public life in general, being a member of the Home Rule Party would definitely be very beneficial for that. Interestingly, and this is just a side fact, its first three leaders were all Protestants: Isaac Butt, William Shaw, and of course Charles Stewart Parnell. Until the middle of the 1880s, Parnell negotiated with both of the big parties at Westminster. So later on, when we're looking at the Home Rule crisis, we're certainly going to focus on the idea of a Liberal alliance between the Home Rule Party and the Liberal Party. And there's a tendency, therefore, in that knowledge to think that that was always the way that it was. But in fact, up until the 1880s, Parnell, with approximately 85 Irish MPs, all Home Rule MPs, all encouraged to vote as a party, used that as a bargaining chip with both Lord Salisbury and with a variety of Liberal leaders, Lord Salisbury as Conservative leader. This ended in 1885 when the Home Rule Party entered into a sort of more formal Liberal alliance. Gladstone, the Liberal leader at the time, made a commitment to Home Rule. And this commitment was significant, and it had a significant repercussion for the Liberal Party. And again, I think it's worth mentioning the Liberal Party itself split because of this. So Gladstone committed to bringing in Home Rule. And this was not a popular policy within the Liberal Party. And a number of Liberals defected to the Conservatives because of this split. Now, later on, this is a lesson that the Conservatives will pay attention to. And when we get to the third Home Rule Bill and the Home Rule crisis that ensued, we see very clearly that the Conservatives correctly identify Home Rule as an issue that they can use to split Liberal support, potentially split the Liberal Party, and hopefully get themselves back into power. So they do have an historical and political precedent for believing that that might be the case, and that dates back to the first Home Rule Bill. The Conservatives at this time, this sort of late 19th century, early 20th century time, were following a policy of killing Home Rule with kindness. And this was a far-sighted policy. If ultimately unsuccessful, it nonetheless was far-sighted. There was a recognition that some of the grievances put forward by the Home Rule Party, some of the reasons put forward for the desirability of Home Rule, had foundation. And really, the policy of killing Home Rule with kindness was designed to try to address some of those issues in the hope that it would reduce the desire for Home Rule. And in many respects, throughout the whole of the 19th century, there was an attempt by successive British governments to try to build a British identity in Ireland, which again ultimately failed. This did mean they introduced a number of reforms, and both the Liberal and Conservative administrations in that period of the late 19th, early 20th century introduced quite far-reaching social reforms. One of the most significant was the Windham Land Act, which of course addressed some of the social issues that the Home Rule Party had been particularly active and campaigning on. This allowed the Home Rule Party then to focus on Home Rule as the main and nearly sole issue and purpose of their campaigning after 1904. Ironically, the leaders of the Home Rule Party, John Dillon and the deputy leader in particular, were very worried that reforms such as the Windham Land Act and the reform of local government in Ireland might reduce the desire for Home Rule, which is of course exactly why those measures were introduced in the first place. In 1886, Gladstone had introduced the first Home Rule Bill, and this Home Rule Bill was easily defeated in the House of Commons. It wasn't popular, as we've already mentioned, even within the Liberal Party, and it certainly was not popular with the Conservatives, so it was defeated out of hand. And the second Home Rule Bill, again introduced by the Liberals in 1892, passed the House of Commons and was defeated in the House of Lords. And of course, this is significant because later on, when it comes to the third Home Rule Bill, if you're a unionist and you're relying on the Lords being able to hold up that bill, then constitutional change that happened in 1911 means that that's no longer available. So it's important that we remember, first Home Rule Bill defeated in the Commons, second Home Rule Bill defeated in the Lords. The Liberals win this landslide majority in 1906, and they have such a huge majority that they have no need for the support of the Irish Home Rule Party. They have a big enough majority to rule comfortably and to be able to pursue what was a very radical package of social reforms. In addition, they were very focused on that package of social reforms, and we'll come back to this a bit later about the position of the leadership with regards to Home Rule at this time. The Home Rule Party had remained dominant throughout this period, in spite of the Parnell split, which did cause a lot of tension within the party, and in spite of the fact that the party realistically between 1880 and 1910 had failed to achieve its overriding aim, this aim of Home Rule. This is partly explained by their constituency work, a trend which has remained very strong in Irish politics this day. Any students who study the politics of the Republic of Ireland and the politics of the UK will note that one of the significant differences is the importance of good constituency work within the Irish system, and how a failure to be a good constituency MP can result in you losing your seat in the next election much more quickly in the Irish system than it would in the UK. They also differed from British parties in that the membership of the Home Rule Party, as it was, the MPs of the Home Rule Party in the House of Commons, were much more socially representative of the people that had voted for them. At this time, Westminster politics was still very much an affair of the gentleman class, the gentry dominated politics. And this was not so much the case with the Home Rule Party, although I think it's fair to say they were dominated by the middle classes, small business owners, etc. They claimed to be a cross-class party, which is often the case with a nationalist-based party. And whilst they make the claim that they're cross-class and also have that subtext that you can't talk about class, we're aiming for home rule, and therefore to talk about class politics might dilute our argument. We'll deal with the class issues later. That type of argument that is quite prevalent around any sort of nationalist type party. They did say that they represented all classes. I think that if we look at individual members who were prevalent, say members who were business owners and played an active role in suppressing workers in the Dublin lockout, for example, we could query some of that, but nonetheless they were much more socially representative than the British parties. And another significant difference was that Parnell started the practice of paying Irish Home Rule MPs. Long before that was introduced for other MPs, and that's very important. It's an important way of democratising who can be elected. It was sneered at by the two big British parties who saw it as sort of ungentlemanly and that you were selling yourself out type thing. However, what it did mean was that people who didn't have independent means could stand to be an MP. Whereas, of course, if you don't pay MPs, the only people who can be MPs are people who have independent wealth from somewhere else. In fact, in 1911, all MPs became salaried, which we'll talk about later on. So in spite of this, I think the Home Rule Party did have some significant achievements. It did not achieve Home Rule by 1910, but what had they achieved? The Land Act, the Universities Act, reform of local government, the extension of the Old Age Pension Act to Ireland, which was very significant given the size of the ageing population there. All of these bills were introduced these weren't Home Rule bills, right? These weren't introduced by the Home Rule Party, but the Home Rule Party with its 85 MPs did have an impact on shaping these bills, particularly this aspect of the old age pension being extended to Ireland. So the other thing I suppose that they were successful in was establishing a pattern, a commitment to democracy and constitutional means, which is important for the later legacy of Ireland. Certainly, a lot of work's been done by the likes of Tom Garvin, for example, looking at the emergence of Irish democracy post partition, post establishment of the Irish Free State, and setting it into European context and perhaps even international context. One of the things that characterised a lot of the newly emerging democracies of that era was the difficulty with which they could remain democratic, that they could slide into all sorts of dictatorship. And Tom Garvin has done a lot of work looking at, was there a risk of the new Irish Free State sliding towards some sort of military dictatorship, for example? And we could argue, this is always the hindsight argument, but what we would say is that the Home Rule Party had shown and demonstrated and created habits that were constitutional habits. And I think that legacy lives on post-treaty, post-war of independence and into the formation of the Irish Free State. The main problem for the Home Rule Party post-1890 is it depends on the Liberals. So 1906, the Liberals win this massive landslide, and they don't need to seduce the Home Rule Party. They don't need to enter into what later on Edward Carson would call a nefarious bargain. They don't need to do that. Also, they're led by Herbert Asquith. Now, Asquith was from the more imperialist wing of the Liberal Party. He's a great social reformer. He's very committed to social reform, social and economic reform. However, he was not predisposed to supporting Home Rule for Ireland, and he was actually quite suspicious of Home Rule for Ireland. And that comes into play. We need to think about this when we're assessing how effectively Asquith handled the Home Rule issue, as later on we might be asked to do. His focus, therefore, is on social reform, not on delivering Home Rule. And he doesn't need, as I say, the support initially of the Home Rulers. Things changed dramatically, however, and certainly from the Home Rule point of view, the opportunity to actually see Home Rule become a reality changed dramatically when the Lords lost their veto in 1911. So very much a British constitutional crisis opened the gateway for Home Rule to become a reality. The Lords had consistently been trying to undermine this Liberal government from 1906. The convention in British politics is that they would not do so. They did have a veto, but that they should use it in a measured way. And that had always been the predominant way of operating between the House of Commons and the House of Lords until 1906. And 1906 returned, as I say, a radical, reforming Liberal government with a radical agenda, which at the time was constantly being denounced as socialism and all of these types of things. And it did break with a lot of the traditions, with the laissez-faire traditions of British politics and way of organising social and economic life. And the Lords consistently stood against this government. And this was a crisis that was brewing. The Liberals knew that they were going to have to take on the Lords. It was going to be a Commons Lords clash at some point, and that point came in 1909 with the budget coined the People's Budget. By convention, the Lords would not reject a government's budget for the very reason that a government that doesn't have its budget passed doesn't have the money to actually put into action its policies, and therefore that would cause the government to fall. That's really the reason behind this idea of you don't go against the people's budget. Now, the other reason is the mandate that the government can claim. They're elected, unlike the Lords. They have a mandate from the public to enact the policies, and therefore to bring in the budget they need to enact the policies. But realistically, the real reason why the Lords don't reject government budgets is because it could cause the government to collapse. And that is just seen as undemocratic and something that you want to avoid. 1909, the Lords reject the budget. Now, it sparks a crisis. There's a general election. And I think that at that time, the Liberals really fully expected to get the same resounding support. They very much focused on this election as a fight between a social reforming elected government and an unelected class ridden House of Lords. But in fact, their vote reduced and their vote went down, and suddenly Redmond and the Home Rule Party hold the balance of power. So things changed dramatically then. The focus between 1909 and 1911 for the Liberal Party and for the government now was to curb the power of the House of Lords. And they set about doing that, introduce the Parliament Bill, which becomes Parliament Act, which does a number of things. What we remember it most for is that it reduced the power of veto of the House of Lords, removed the power of veto, and meant that the Lords could only delay a bill that had been passed by the Commons, passed 3 times in the exact same wording. It could only be delayed for 2 years. This is an important change in the British Constitution. Later on, it would be extended by the 1949 Parliament Act, which actually reduced that veto further to remove the veto, to the power of delay to 1 year. But it's significant, particularly if you're a Home Rule MP or indeed a Unionist. And if we remember, the second Home Rule Bill was defeated by the House of Lords. Well, that ability of the House of Lords to actually defeat a bill has now effectively been taken away. The best the House of Lords can do is delay it for 2 years. So this is really a very significant difference in terms of any prospective Home Rule, bearing in mind that this also happens at the exact time when the Home Rule Party is needed by the Liberals in order to get through some of their other social reforms. There were other things in that Parliament Act which I think are worth mentioning before we just round off this lecture today. The other thing that it did was limit the time that the government could sit. Before the Parliament Act, governments could sit for 7 years. We were elected for 7 years. This limits it to 5 years. And it also introduced, for the first time, pay for all MPs. This is when all MPs begin to get a salary. So the Lords themselves, while this bill was going through, were really forced to make a choice. I mean, it would be a sensible question to ask, well, why did they vote for it? Why did they vote for a reduction in power? And really it's because they had to make a choice between their powers and seeing a reduction in their powers or their identity. Because one of the threats that was held out to get it across that boundary was that Asquith held out the threat that the House of Lords would be flooded with hundreds more Liberal peers if they refused to pass this piece of legislation. And in the end, they vote narrowly in favour of maintaining their exclusive identity, but giving up some of their powers in the form of this bill. In 1912, once the Parliament Act had been settled and that issue had been resolved, Asquith introduces a third Home Rule Bill. So April 1912, the third Home Rule Bill is introduced. The first bill had been defeated by the Commons. The second had been defeated by the Lords. We know after 1911 the Lords can no longer reject a bill out of hand. And here we have the stage set for the Home Rule crisis and Ulster resistance.